Hello, I'm Claire Smith and welcome to my channel. So today's video is going to be 6 reasons why your fragrance got discontinued. If you've been into fragrance for a little bit of time, you will know that you can fall in love with a fragrance and come to the end of a bottle of it and then suddenly go and look for another one and realise that fragrance is gone. And this is just going to be a video about the reasons why that happens. So if you haven't seen me before, I'm Claire Smith. I make videos all about perfume, perfume science, perfume history, perfume psychology even, and I also just do some straight perfume reviews and also fun perfume tags. So if that kind of thing interests you and you haven't already done so, then please do consider subscribing and please also like this video if you do like this kind of content. So reason one is that there's been some kind of regulatory change. So you may have heard of IFRA. IFRA stands for the International Fragrance Association. They're basically a trade body that acts on behalf of the fragrance industry, and they head off any kind of health concern that comes up to do with fragrance. So if they have any kind of information about a scientific study, or if they have any reports from people saying that a particular ingredient has caused them an allergic reaction, they will act pretty swiftly. And they tend to be even harsher than the laws that are surrounding fragrance. So they will be harsher than US law and they will be harsher than EU law to try to maintain fragrance being sellable across the world. So IFRA have actually created a number of different amendments to what they allow in fragrances. I think we're on the 50-something amendment now. They will either ban substances or they will reduce the amounts, the concentrations that are allowed in fragrances. And back in 2012, they announced that they were going to control the substance oak moss because of 2 compounds within oak moss that caused allergic reactions. So this is commonly termed the oak moss crisis in fragrance because so many fragrances had to be reformulated as a result of this change. And they gave the industry 2 years to bring in this change. But fragrances such as CK1 had to be reformulated, Mitsuko by Guerlain, also Chanel's No. 19, and also the original Miss Dior from 1947 had to be reformulated, along with many others. But we know that other fragrances were just quietly discontinued. And this is the same every time there's an IFRA change. So the more recent example is Lilial. Lilial has actually now been banned from fragrances. So Lilial was used to evoke the smell of lily of the valley, and it was banned from fragrances, I think, in 2022. So again, there was this grace period where existing fragrances could be reformulated and they had some notice. And one fragrance that I did notice temporarily disappear from fragrance shelves was Alien EDT. And I know for sure that that one contained Lilial. And I guess it was being reformulated when it was taken off shelves. But again, we know that other fragrances will have just quietly been discontinued. I really feel like IFRA changes can be the final nail in the coffin for fragrances that perhaps aren't selling that well, or fragrances that are perhaps really difficult to reformulate. So perhaps the fragrance itself just cannot be made in a way that doesn't have that ingredient but still smells something similar. Or perhaps that fragrance just costs too much money to reformulate. Perhaps the ingredients are just too expensive that they would need to use. And that can also be a reason why that fragrance gets discontinued. So that's reason one, IFRA regulatory changes. So reason two is that there may be some kind of ingredient supply issue, or the price of the ingredient may suddenly rise. And that is going to put a price pressure on fragrance manufacturers. So too, there can be also natural variation in the harvest. So for example, flowers are going to be very susceptible to the climate. They're going to be very susceptible to the weather conditions that year. And that natural variation is really a big problem in the fragrance industry and is why natural ingredients are so problematic, because there is that variation in how they smell from year to year, and also in the yield and the quality of the fragrance ingredients from year to year. Sadly, sometimes natural ingredients have their usage restricted because either the use of the ingredient itself causes some kind of organism to be endangered, or it causes environmental damage to actually obtain that substance from nature. And really we've seen this with critically endangered species such as the musk deer back in the 1970s. That resulted in a ban on the use of deer musks in fragrance. And also we've seen the effects of sandalwood harvesting in Indian forests. So that's also been banned. So there's been a replacement of natural sandalwood with Javanol and other sandalwood-like fragrance alternatives. So I think really there is a lot of caution around using natural resources and overuse of natural resources in fragrance. And that has caused a lot of issues with certain fragrances having to be reformulated, and again, lots of fragrances being discontinued because those natural ingredients cannot be sought. A good example for reason 2 would be something like Dior's Midnight Poison, which was rumoured to have been discontinued because of a difficult to find fragrance ingredient that it contained, but nobody seems to know exactly which ingredient that was. I really think that reasons 1 and reasons 2 are very legitimate reasons to discontinue something. I think if you struggle to reformulate something that smell vaguely like the original fragrance, then it's sometimes just better for everybody if it's just discontinued. There's really nothing worse than smelling a fragrance that you used to love in a less good version. It's really upsetting. So I think that these 2 reasons are very valid for me for why things should perhaps be considered to be discontinued instead of just reformulated. So reason 3 is that there's a legal dispute between brands. So really this video is proving to me that you only really see these reasons in the flesh when you notice something weird go on. So the weird thing that I've noticed here is the recent discontinuation and then rebranding almost of Maison Alhambra's Tom Ford dupes. I don't know whether you noticed it, but they all disappeared from the market and they all came back with different names. And I think that's because Maison Alhambra may have received some kind of cease and desist letter from Tom Ford or perhaps from Estee Lauder, the parent company. So I assume the fragrances themselves weren't reformulated, but I did notice the name changes. So for example, Tom Ford's Bitter Peach in the Maison Alhambra version used to be called Bright Peach, but now it's called Coral Blush. The Neroli Portofino dupe used to be called Porto Neroli, and now it's been rebranded as Pacific Blue. So they've just sort of distanced themselves a little bit more from the Tom Ford branding. And the bottles have also changed in how they look as well, which I think they were pretty close to the Tom Ford ones originally. So I just think that's a really interesting sort of take on discontinuation, isn't it? Because technically that fragrance is called something different. So has that fragrance actually been discontinued? Is that a new fragrance because it's got a new name? Or do we not count that as a discontinuation? Who knows? Another example I can think of with a sort of similar situation, but with a very different circumstance, would be something like YSL's Ivresse. So originally that fragrance was called Champagne, but actually Champagne is a denomination of sparkling wine, isn't it? You have to have champagne from the Champagne region in France. And so the growers of Champagne actually objected to YSL's use of the name. The Growing Association of Champagne Makers objected, and that's why YSL had to change the name from Champagne to Ivresse, but they kept the champagne cork style bottle at least. More recently, you might have noticed Perfumes de Marly's fragrance. They announced a fragrance called Sutton. It then changed its name to Epsom, and finally by the time it reached market it was actually renamed Greenly. So the problem with Sutton was that Bond No. 9 had a fragrance called Sutton Place, and I think Bond No. 9 stepped in and said, no, that's too similar, you can't have that name. And so then Parfums de Marly went through this kind of process of renaming the fragrance. So, you know, it's clearly not just the smaller brands that have these issues. Another example that I can think of, a very recent example, is Frederic Malle's Synthetic Nature, which was rebranded from Synthetic Jungle. So I always assumed that maybe it was Kenzo that was stepping in with this one and saying, hang on a minute, we've got a fragrance called Jungle. But it had been out a while, so I don't know whether it was some kind of issue with the use of the word jungle perhaps. I'm not too sure what the reason was for that. But again, that fragrance has changed its name, although I don't believe that it's been reformulated. But please let me know if it has been reformulated. In other cases, fragrances have completely disappeared from the market because of legal disputes. They haven't just simply been renamed. And there was also a fragrance that was by Molinard that was contested by Clarins and by Mugler because Molinard's fragrance smelt similar to Angel. So reason 5 is that there's no immediate success. So if you think about times gone by with fragrance, you know, there wasn't social media. There wasn't huge amounts of PR going on, lots of fragrance gifting, lots of hype. That's a new creation. But that really puts a lot of pressure on a fragrance to be immediately successful, for a fragrance company to want to continue to make it and produce it and push it with advertising. And, you know, when you think about older fragrances, so if you think, for example, about Angel by Mugler, that fragrance came out in 1992. It took many years for that fragrance to really take off. It wasn't an immediate success. It was a word of mouth thing in the slower times before social media. So social media really has sped up that process. And, you know, would Mugler have kept Angel on the market nowadays? Would Angel be as successful in today's market? I mean, I know tastes move on, but still, Mugler's Angel did not reach the #1 in France until 6 years after its release. It didn't reach #1 until 1998. So would it have made it that far, or would it have just been discontinued? How many new fragrances now reach their 6th birthday even? I wouldn't think it's that many percentage-wise. Social media and the fast fashion sort of ethos of fragrance these days, and the fact that people don't have signature fragrances anymore in the most part, has really caused this shortening of the lifetime of fragrances. And really that means that things that aren't continually successful over very short periods of time end up in the bargain bin quite quickly and are just quietly forgotten about and discontinued. If you look at this graph showing the amount of fragrance released each year from 1980 onwards, you can see there's been a huge acceleration in fragrance releases over the last few years. We actually had peak Perfume back in 2018. There was a bit of a dip because of the pandemic, but right now we're around 6,000 releases per year. So effectively it's a very crowded market, and we know that costs are fundamentally important to designer fragrance houses. So if something's not selling, it's going. So reason 5 is that tastes change. So times move on, and fragrances that were once perhaps the best sellers are just not doing as well as they once were. And that's just a case of the trends in fragrance, isn't it? If you think about how fragrances smelt to you when you were growing up, when you were a teenager, versus how they smelt to you in your late 20s or your late 30s, you can see that there's always evolution in the fragrance market, and the trends come and go. So when I was growing up, aquatic kind of freshies were the trend, or powdery florals. And then when I was actually sort of in my 20s, it was more fritulis. And now I would say it's more sort of gourmand fragrances. That's really where the trend has gone. And that means that fragrances can just smell dated in a way because they don't smell like now. It doesn't make them suddenly bad fragrances. It just means they're not on trend. So for example, I recently decluttered Richie Richie by Nina Ricci. And as much as I love that fragrance, to me it just smells like it's not now. It smells like it's from the 2010s. And again, that doesn't make it a bad fragrance. I think it's a lovely fragrance. I just wasn't reaching for it. And it just struck me how it just smells like it's from another time. And that fragrance isn't that old. It's only from 2009. What's that, like 15 years ago? So even in 15 years, you can smell the difference. The trends just move on. As soon as sales tail off, costs rise because of economies of scale, and a fragrance company is not going to keep something that isn't profitable for them. Of course, as well, there's also the very famous example of the ever-changing faces of certain fragrances. So Miss Dior is a classic example of a fragrance that is basically being discontinued every few years. But then a new version is launched that's called exactly the same thing or something very similar. So in 2005, we had Miss Dior Cherie. We then had a relaunch of Miss Dior in 2012, and that fragrance really smelt like Dior's version of Coco Mademoiselle. It was probably a more rosy version of Coco Mademoiselle. And then in 2017, they discontinued the 2012 version, reformulated and relaunched, and we got a sweet, syrupy rose patchouli fragrance. Then in 2021, discontinued again, reformulated, relaunched. It's now a fruity floral fragrance. So you can see that Dior just have this idea of Miss Dior being for a certain age group. And in order to keep Miss Dior fresh for that age group, something that age group are going to want to reach for, they have to a certain extent at least, follow some kind of trends in the market. And that's why they continually discontinue, reformulate, relaunch under the same name, much to everybody's annoyance. I think the conclusion here is really that fragrance houses don't want to spread themselves too thinly. It's not efficient for a fragrance house to have lots of lines of fragrance. They are going to want to concentrate on the ones that are the most profitable and that are the biggest sellers. And that means that they're going to be ruthless in discontinuing anything that just isn't in vogue at the time. So reason 6 is simply changes in direction of the fragrance house. So we saw this a lot with designer fragrance houses during COVID. So it can be that they just run out of their contracts with their conglomerate brand and they have to try to renegotiate another contract with another brand. And that can really make them reassess where they want to focus their efforts. So often designer brands will target the fragrance market as a way for people to become more familiar with the brand name. So for example, if you think about Marc Jacobs, they've gone into fragrance, but they've also gone into makeup. And that's because those kinds of things are very affordable ways for people to experience the brand name, to see the brand name, for it to become a more familiar thing in the market. Once people have bought maybe some fragrance, they might buy some makeup, they might buy a handbag, they might end up buying a dress. You know, there's a progression there, isn't there? There's a trust being established in the brand name. That's why designer brands go into fragrance. But during COVID, we saw a bit of a reversal in this. So during COVID, a lot of brands wanted to hunker down and focus more on their core businesses. So for example, we lost such gems such as Balenciaga, we also lost Fendi, and we also lost Bottega Veneta. So particularly Balenciaga and Bottega Veneta were brands that I have really enjoyed, and I'm really sad that they've gone from the fragrance market because I think they really produce some really interesting fragrances. Thankfully, I never actually got to try Fendi, so I can't regret them leaving, but I'm sure they were amazing too. You know, during the pandemic, even brands such as Kayali took a bit of a hiatus because they just had supply problems with getting bottles. Also, a lot of manufacturing in, you know, bottling factories, etc., etc. They turned their businesses over to COVID-based industries because that was the thing that was most needed at the time. And so the fragrance industry suffered because, you know, there were things like glass was just at a short supply. They just couldn't get things to put fragrances in to launch new fragrance, let alone, you know, have a successful marketing campaign in a lockdown situation. So you can see why certain brands left the market. So we've also seen discontinuations when there's been a change of brand director. So more recently, we've seen this with Gucci. So Gucci were in serious financial woe and they have changed their brand director. And you can see that the direction of their fragrances has changed. You may have noticed that Gucci's gone far more mass market with their fragrances. They're far less interesting than they used to be. Gucci used to be quite almost niche feeling in its fragrance directions. It had very interesting fragrances. Nowadays, it has just very sweet, very crowd-pleasing fragrances. And I think that's been a conscious decision on the brand's part. I think a noticeable casualty here is a fragrance like Memoir d'une Odeur. That fragrance really does not sit within the normal catalogue of Gucci these days. And I think that's why that one's been discontinued, because it's just not a mass market kind of fragrance. It's not going to bring them lots of profit, I don't think. We've also recently seen a change of direction with brands like Amouage. So Amouage used to be very much of a certain style. They had a very Amouage feel about them. They used a lot of resins. They had things about their fragrances that made them stand out, that made them perhaps not the friendliest, not the easiest fragrance house to get along with. If you look at their more recent releases, they've gone much sweeter. They've gone much more mass market. You know, fragrances like Love Delight, for example, not very amouage. That's also coincided with the new brand director. And I think that's also been part of the reason why a lot of their older fragrances have disappeared. There's been a change in brand direction. We also see this change in brand direction when brands are sold. So for example, Mugler was sold back in 2020. So it used to be owned by Clarins and L'Oreal took over. And actually a lot of Mugler flankers in particular were discontinued pretty much immediately, but even main lines of fragrance. So for example, Aura, I really feel like Womanity is probably on its way out. I see it sometimes on the Mugler website, but I don't see it anywhere else. I feel like maybe Angel Nova is going as well. I think L'Oreal just have their eyes on the purse strings a little bit more than perhaps Clarins did. They're just going in a different direction to the direction that Clarins used to go in. So yeah, it's just a real shame, isn't it, when brands really change direction with their fragrances, but it's just something that happens and we just all have to live with discontinuations these days. It's going to become more and more a thing, and I think reformulation is going to become more and more a thing as well. So thank you so much for watching. If you have enjoyed this video, then please press the like button and please also consider subscribing if you haven't done already. And please let me know if you can think of any other reasons why a fragrance could be discontinued. And also please let me know your favourite discontinued fragrance, the one you miss the most, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.